Tell me about these elements.
They are the four elements which comprise the very existence of your realm. They are earth, wind, water, and fire. With your mastery of the element of cold, you have an advantage that no other human has, and that is the ability to defeat the elements. I have foreseen this.
So ContraPoints likes to talk about lead, and this is another example of why we use data over anecdote and glittering generalities, like...
And as a result, 93,000 children with lead poisoning have been added to Maryland's lead registry, and in Baltimore, the vast majority of these children are black. Many of these kids were later awarded structured settlements as compensation for permanent brain damage.
Well, we actually have data from the CDC on this, and there's almost no race difference here. Yes, lead exposure does have effects, but this is the David Sherratt fallacy, confusing a potential cause for an actual cause. Sure, eating arsenic will lower your IQ, but to say that it's responsible for race differences in IQ, you have to show some sort of race difference in arsenic consumption.
But I don't want to overstate the lead crime theory either.
You overstated the importance of lead the moment you brought it up. This is what happens when you use shitlib rags as your sources instead of looking at primary data.
Please don't get all your information from YouTube. I've put some links in the description with my sources and some further reading on the topic.
You like to mock people who get their information from YouTube video makers? Well, here's an instance where they would be clearly better informed listening to a YouTube video maker, in this case me, than they would be listening to Vox or Atlantic or whatever trashy magazine you got your lead talking point from. And let me let you in on a little secret here. The people who write these articles don't know anything. They're mostly journalism majors, or in the odd occasion that they're experts, quote unquote, who have to write the science beat or whatever. These are just people who the journalists, all the journalism majors at the New York Times, or all the journalism majors at Fox, or all the journalism majors at the Atlantic. It's just people who these journalism majors, these know-nothings, happen to imagine is an expert. All right, enough grandstanding on this lead thing.
1. Freddie Gray.
Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray. Listen, I'm not going into your little funhouse here. I can find events of cops unfairly assaulting whites without due process too. Now, with normal people, I usually don't have to explain why we use statistics and not anecdotes. But with you, who knows, maybe you have to actually have it explained to you why we use data instead of stories. Your point with this is that cops are unfair to blacks, and there's a few ways we know this isn't the case. The first is that the racial ratios of the National Crime Victimization Survey and police arrests line up almost perfectly over the long run. If cops are unfairly targeting blacks, well, then I guess there's a whole conspiracy across the whole United States for people to claim to be victims of crime that just so happens to line up perfectly with police reports. The second reason we know cops aren't unfairly anti-black has to do with cop killers. Blacks make up 44% of the people who kill a policeman, but only 30% of those killed by a policeman. Whites and Hispanics are combined in the chart of cop killers and separated in the chart of those killed by cops. Now, if cops are unfairly targeting blacks, we would expect blacks to make up a greater proportion of those killed by cops than they are of the cop killers. The third reason we know cops aren't unfairly targeting blacks is that when cops are required to wear a body camera, they're actually more, not less, they are more likely to shoot a black person than when they're not wearing a body camera. This is the opposite of what you would predict if cops were unfairly targeting blacks. So put a camera on them so they can't get away with it. No, when the event is recorded, cops are actually more confident in shooting a black person. They are more likely to do that which needs to be done, not less. Another piece of evidence, and this is a little weaker, is experimental, where cops will play a simulation where they have to decide to shoot or not shoot people, very quickly. And cops actually take longer to shoot blacks than they do to shoot whites in these crime simulations. Now, personally, I don't think this is too meaningful. It is just a simulation after all. The cops could be trying to appear not racist for the simulation, though in fairness, the cops are not told at the beginning that their time on whether to shoot someone who's black or Hispanic or white, that the race differences in their time to shoot will be measured. So they're not told that this is going to be timed. But we just know that if the results showed that cops were more trigger happy with blacks, shitlibs would be all over this. Shitlibs would not be charitable about this at all and say, and we wouldn't say, it's just a simulation. No, they would be promoting this front and center if the results weren't what they are. And the last thing to consider among blacks is their disproportionate number of homicides compared to other crimes. Homicides have a dead body, and most of the time it's not a mystery whodunit. So we can compare homicides to other crimes and see that blacks are more overrepresented in homicides than they are in other crimes like rape, robbery, assault, which are all going to be massively influenced by reporting bias and by what the cops happen to catch. But homicide, this is much harder to hide, and the cops don't really have a lot of discretion on that. And on crimes where there's more subjectivity, more reporting issues, and the cops have some discretion whether or not to prosecute, blacks are actually less overrepresented than they are for homicides. When there's more discretion, blacks are less overrepresented, the opposite of what you would expect to see if the cops were unfairly targeting blacks. If the cops were unfairly targeting blacks, you would expect blacks to be more overrepresented in those crimes that have gray area or discretion. But the fact that it's the opposite is evidence that cops are kind of coddling blacks to a degree. So the plurality of evidence is that cops actually go easy on blacks a little bit. One last thing to add on this topic is that the incarceration rate ratio today between blacks and whites is actually higher than it was during Jim Crow. So if the cops in courts were anti-black during Jim Crow, well then they must be a lot more now. Or maybe, let's try this, maybe they were never biased against blacks. No, that can't be. Because you have all these data-phobic, quote-unquote, historians telling you cinematic stories about struggle and oppression that you just want to believe, right? So ContraPoints pushes the poverty causes crime myth. Of course, there's going to be a correlation, but all this means is that criminals tend to be poor. Okay, so maybe the genes that drive one to criminality also tend to drive one to being poor. Certainly plausible genetic explanation. So at first glance, this is a chicken and egg issue. But we have some natural experiments in the United States that can help settle this, where we can look at the change in the poverty rate and changes in crime. And what we find is that crime, both violent crime and property crime, tend to increase when the economy is doing well and tend to go down when the economy is doing poorly. On top of that, there are several countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland, that are poorer than the US blacks but have a lower homicide rate. Homicide being the only crime I'm willing to compare between countries, and even then only within OECD countries that have a certain level of standardization for this stuff. And this ties into another point. Black Americans aren't poor. There are plenty of white populations around the world who are poorer than blacks who don't have any of the problems and pathologies that blacks in the US have. A study by Capasoa, Brialt, and Harrison in 1995 actually found that, with several other factors seen here controlled for, poverty actually is negatively correlated with property crime and with violent crime. This replicates what we see with the recessions in criminality, in that poverty appears to drive crime down, not up. Going to church also appears to have a causal effect of lowering both property and violent crime. The percent black beat out every factor for property crime except education level, population change, and percent urban, right? Education level of an area positively correlating with property crime. But the percent black in an area was the best predictor for violent crime.
The long-term effect of these practices was that many black families ended up trapped in decaying neighborhoods with bad schools.
Oh yes, bad schools. Bad schools, of course he did. The bad schools myth. The way we know the bad schools myth is a myth is from a form of natural experiment called lottery voucher studies. These are useful in that everyone has an opportunity to apply for a voucher, and the people who get them are randomly selected. So we can compare the people who got vouchers to those who didn't, and it's apples to apples because everyone in the study applied for them. And we can see the results of the lottery voucher program in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, and in Washington, D.C. Arguably, the Cleveland program showed improvement in the voucher population as the voucher kids did better at all grade levels. My issue with the Cleveland study, however, is that it started in grade 1, so we don't have any prior baseline, and the voucher students had a 9-point advantage in grade 1 and a 15-point advantage in grade 6, so it's not clear if it was the voucher program or that the people who got that voucher happened to just be better, that it was just a sampling error. It could just be a random sampling error. But even if you think there wasn't any sample bias in the Cleveland study, the effects here are still marginal. And intuitively, I can think of a reason why a potentially smart person would do better in a quote-unquote bad school than a good school. If you're the only smart person, you'll get a lot more attention. You'll be able to develop more personal relationships with your teacher because you're the only one who has any desire to do so. You won't feel as pressured since you're far away the best person at school. Whereas if you're at a good school, you won't be anything special. As a result, you might not put as much effort into schoolwork because you're just another face. You're not the best. If you're the best, you're really gonna have that as your identity and put more effort into it, and you're gonna be more interested in it. And it's gonna be more fun because you're the one good student talking to the teachers, or maybe one of a small handful. But this is all just storytelling. But the point is that while you can certainly imagine ways in which a quote-unquote good school would be better for a given student, I can think of ways in which a quote-unquote bad school would actually be better for a student of any given ability level. And given that we can both tell stories about good schools and bad schools, we need to go back to the data. And the data says no effect, or if you want to look at the Cleveland study results, a very marginal effect. So ContraPoints brings up the drug use myth.
For instance, black and white people use weed at about the same rate, but black people are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for it. And we're talking about a drug that, at this point, white America has basically decided shouldn't really even be illegal anyway.
Now, the first major problem is all these studies are based on self-report, and there's several studies I have showing that blacks are more likely to lie about using drugs. They're anywhere from twice as likely to 25 times as likely to lie about their drug use than whites are, depending on the study. The second problem is that even if everyone was telling the truth, which is obviously not the case, it doesn't tell us how much they were using. For example, a study of 88 juvenile delinquents and hair cocaine content found that blacks who were arrested for whatever reason had 7 times as much cocaine content as inferred from hair analysis as whites who were arrested. So even if blacks and whites always told the truth about having ever used a certain drug, which they don't, it doesn't even tell us very much. And the more you use a drug, the more you buy a drug, well, the more chances there are of getting caught. If every black drug user on average uses drugs 7 times as often, you're going to expect them to get caught more often, even if the total number of drug users is the same or even lower. On top of that, blacks are more than twice as likely to buy drugs outside as whites are, and over 3 times as likely to buy drugs from a stranger as whites are. So there you have it. Blacks probably do more drugs just in terms of total volume of drugs, not necessarily the number of people who ever use drugs one time. Blacks tend to lie about doing drugs anywhere from 2 to 25 times as much as whites, so all this data ContraPoints uses based on self-report is rendered dubious from that alone. And blacks are 2 and 3 times more likely to buy drugs outside and from a stranger, where they are more likely to get caught by a snitch or by a sting operation. ContraPoints says that these drug laws are really shitty, and I mostly agree. I agree that drug users shouldn't be thrown in jail, but these substances do create an addiction, and the ability to weigh the consequences of your actions is heavily impaired under the influence of these substances. So I think drug users need help, but drug dealers need the bullet. But that said, the idea that blacks are unfairly targeted for drug crimes, this is very tenuous. Your self-report data is crap for all the reasons that I laid out here.
2. Redlining. The FHA adopted a policy of refusing to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, which were colored in red on official maps.
Okay, I've been over this before in my video response to Spooge Job Soy Pants from College Humor, so alright, let's get into this. We know that since the 1950s, the black-white gap in home ownership has been roughly the same. Moreover, since the 1970s, residential segregation in the United States has increased when redlining was actually outlawed. These are both reasons why it's pretty apparent that, pardon my French here, but redlining appears to not have mattered. Redlining, for all the hubbub about redlining, probably didn't matter, at least in terms of the effects then versus the effects today. And this is because banks today actually engage in pure racial discrimination just like they did back then. Now, please don't demand a source on this. This is actually a shitlib talking point. Right? Tim Wise brings this up all the time. I'm tired. This is true. Just accept it. Banks do regularly engage in pure racial discrimination. When credit score is controlled for, banks are still more likely to lend to a white person than they are to a black person. But the hell of it is, the default rate by race is within 2% of each other. So this is bullseye. There's very little variation between the races in terms of default rates. There's almost no residual here. The banks are accurately assessing risk. I don't know exactly how many points being white is worth, but let's say it's 30. If it's 30, it would go something like this. A white person with a credit score of 670 gets a loan of 5% interest, but a black person, to get the same loan, would need a credit score of 700. And on aggregate, a black with a credit score of 700 will default as often as a white with a credit score of 670 for the same loan in principle. Again, I don't know if it's 30 points or 50 points or 20 points, but this is how it works in principle. And look, if you think the banks are leaving money on the table by doing this, if you think they're irrationally discriminating in a way that's not optimally responding to the lending market, well then by all means put your money where your mouth is and give loans in a race neutral fashion and carve into that margin and get some money for yourself. Not necessarily you in particular, ContraPoints. I don't think you have a lot of investing capital, but it's been 50 years since people knew this was happening. If there was money to be made on this margin, someone would have already done it. There was a congressional investigation on this in the 2000s, and the investigation concluded that banks were accurately assessing risk and that the credit score isn't a crystal ball. Race still matters.
What's happened is a sub-industry has emerged of shark lawyers who swoop in on the lead poisoning victims, some of whom can't even read a contract, and offer to buy out their structured monthly settlements in exchange for a lump sum that's a fraction of the total worth of the settlement. 4. Blockbusting. Predatory real estate agents often used a scheme known as blockbusting, where they'd intentionally provoke fear of an impending minority takeover among residents of a white neighborhood. They would then exploit the fear that they created to trick white homeowners into selling their houses at below market prices, so they could resell those same houses at extortionate prices to black families desperate to escape the ghetto.
Well, I don't know what to do about this. Like, a fool and his money are soon parted. I don't know what your solution is for this. Do you want to have for every black person to have some sort of minder to tell them how to manage their finances? I don't know what your solution to this is supposed to be. One thing that ContraPoints does here that I see all the time among shitlibs is imagining that there are inherently bad neighborhoods. Now, while that idea is obviously just insane on its face, and you should just be able to say something like, there's literally no reason to believe that there are inherently bad neighborhoods, and it's obvious that a bad neighborhood is really just a black neighborhood, I think there are some ways we can show this more strongly. One thing we can look at are the hollowing out of what used to be good neighborhoods once the blacks moved in. They became ghettos. They became bad neighborhoods. Entire cities, Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, St. Louis, South Chicago, now known as Chicongo or Shit Congo. Here's a starker way to put it. What happened to Baltimore is precisely what segregation was meant to stop. What happened to Detroit is what segregation was trying to stop. What happened to basically the inner city everywhere was what segregation policies in the past were trying to stop. And it was a failure to stop this that caused all of these once good neighborhoods to become Africanized. ContraPoint says he's not trying to make you believe in white guilt.
No, I don't have any white guilt. That's not what this is about. That's just more white narcissism is what that is. So wipe away those white ass tears. Here.
And then he turns around and says,
in this country's ongoing insistence on treating a problem of injustice as if it were simply a problem of criminality. I know I said my interest in this topic isn't a matter of white guilt, and it's not, but also, fellow whites, how do we sleep at night? In this guided meditation, you're going to relax your body and release your guilt. You're not responsible for what your great-grandparents did. As you ease the tension in each muscle group, exhale deeply and repeat the mantra. Black Lives Matter are the real racists.
Okay, so I'm not trying to say you should feel guilty for being white, but I'm just saying that white people are horrible and you benefit from that and you owe restitution to everyone else on the planet. Look, ContraPoints, you're just afraid of the term white guilt because you know it's true, and you know using it is an effective way to snap people out of your moral bullying trance that you have. One thing that ContraPoints likes to do is say people of color.
But disproportionately, people of color are victimized by this system. Incarceration of people of color, and then you should go subscribe to a bunch of people of color and listen to what they have to say.
Now, people who use this term, people of color, are invariably an anti-white racist to some degree or another. first off, it's a falsehood. There's obviously more diversity of color among Europeans than there is among everyone else combined, who are just shades of brown, for whatever you think this matters. I think it's an implicit slur on whites. You lack color, you're stale, unlike the vibrant people of color, but whatever. But think about someone who uses the term Gentile a lot. Someone who says Gentile is probably anti-Jewish. He has a word for everyone else that Jews are excluded from. We should always keep in mind the historical context of all this. The world prior to the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe lived on about $500 to $700 a day. And almost all of what are classified as significant inventions, according to a set of over 100 scientific encyclopedias, almost all came after the year 1600. The scientific development prior to that was a little midget battle that didn't have hardly any impact on the standard of living of the people of that day, and there were retrogressions. Technology would be lost. There are absolutely no signs, no reason to believe that China or India, let alone anywhere else, was ever going to have an industrial revolution. So anything you have above $500, or let's say $700, or let's be generous, anything you have over $1,000 a year, you can thank white people. Now, if you want to learn more about this, you can look at my video, The European Revolution, and all of the sources therein. So when someone like ContraPoints talks about white guilt, which is precisely what he's doing, he's talking about some things white people did that potentially possibly caused some brown people to be lower within the range of between subsistence and the top 1% of the world. But the fact that any of them are within that range in the first place and not right at subsistence is because of white people.
1. Restrictive covenants. When the 1910 ordinance was overturned, Baltimore's mayor created an official Committee on Segregation, which cooperated with neighborhood associations to pressure landlords in white neighborhoods to sign covenants committing them never to sell or rent to black residents. These agreements were enforced through strategic building and health code citations issued against owners and by evictions of black renters who violated the covenant.
Now, ContraPoints just says this like this is some terrible evil, but this is literally what all countries do with outsiders, and none of these white people here ever agreed that blacks were their countrymen. There was no referendum, there was no plebiscite, there was no vote among whites in the US to make blacks their countrymen. Blacks were not citizens. So another thing to consider is that Detroit and Philadelphia, prior to general emancipation in 1865, the freed blacks in those cities were both legally and residentially integrated. In fact, prior to general emancipation, there was not a single majority black neighborhood in Detroit or Philadelphia. Those blacks were not segregated. These were the blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, and so we can surmise that they were higher quality people than the general black population. Historians who write about the time, for whatever you think that's worth, certainly agree that these were much more white-presenting blacks. They were not particularly criminal, they were not any more criminal than the white population, and they were not any less industrious than the white population. And objectively, we know that the anti-black laws in northern cities didn't take off until general emancipation, until whites came into contact with not just the talented 10th blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, but the average blacks who were not able to do so. And it was this experience that caused the whites to start to erect both legal and outright physical barriers between them and the blacks in the northern cities. The same thing happened in South Africa. Initially, blacks were not excluded from anything in South Africa. It was only after years of hard experience that the whites in South Africa enacted segregation laws to keep the blacks apart. It wasn't pre-Judice, it was post-Judice. We have another natural experiment on this. We have whites who have had long, regular contact with blacks in one part of the country, and white people who live far away from blacks. If anti-black sentiment was pre-Judice and not post-Judice, we would expect whites in the South to have a more positive view of blacks than whites in the North do. But you know that it's the opposite. Now, of course, ContraPoints is going to come in and say, well, the reason that whites in the South have negative views of blacks is because of history of racism and oppression and slavery and institutional norms and blah, 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 blah. Right? All these sociological rabbit holes he'll go down to say that whites in the South have negative views of blacks because they have had negative views of blacks for a long time. That's basically what he's saying. And what's so disingenuous about this is that you just know that if whites in the South had more positive views of blacks than whites in the North did, people like ContraPoints would be jumping on that data straight away way to say, see, those who have more contact with blacks actually have more positive views of them. But because it's the opposite, ContraPoints is going to spin you a tale about all the institutionalisms as to why whites in the South don't like blacks as much as whites in Maine do. And you even see this dynamic in the UK, where whites in England, which is further south, are more anti-immigrant than whites in Scotland are. This is because whites in England have more experience with African and South Asians than the Scots do, being closer to London and being where those people tend to be settled. Now, I know you try to interface with reality as little as possible, ContraPoints, so you almost certainly won't watch or listen to this video, but on the off chance that you do, could you, ContraPoints, tell me what view I'm supposed to have of black people? Now, I'm not asking for a platitudes. I'm not asking for any bullshit like, just treat all people with dignity. No, you tell me, based on their behavior, how I am supposed to evaluate this group. Should my evaluation be more like the white South Africans and the whites in the South who have long, hard experience with blacks? Or should my view of blacks be more like those of white people in Maine or Iceland?
No, I don't have any white guilt. That's not what this is about. That's just more white narcissism is what that is. So wipe away those white ass tears. Here, I'll pick you out a cotton ball.
Oh yeah, this shit. Look, I'm not letting these little bullshit jabs slide. Blacks in the US should be thanking their lucky stars for the Atlantic slave trade. Blacks in the Americas almost certainly would have been slaves within Africa if not for the Atlantic slave trade. And there's a few ways we can infer this. The first is that the slave trade within Africa was about 9 times that of the Atlantic slave trade at the time of the Atlantic slave trade. And approximately 40% of the population of Black Africa were slaves at the time. And this was true until the continent was taken over by Europe. Right? It was Europeans who stopped slavery within Africa. We also know this from the inelasticity of supply. Basically what this means is that an increase in the demand for slaves always resulted in a several order of magnitude increase in the price of slaves, which is evidence that the slave traders could not increase the supply of slaves in response to any increase in demand. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. Capturing people and selling them into slavery is a hard thing. It's not easy to just go out and say, I think I'll get more slaves because the price is higher. It was probably hard to become a slaver in the first place. It was dangerous and difficult to capture slaves, and slavers just got as many slaves as they could. It's not like building cars or growing corn. And so an increase in the number of buyers or the number of money willing to buy slaves was not going to increase the number of slaves produced. At least that's what the inelasticity of supply implies, and intuitively it makes sense that this would be the case. On top of that, black slaves, once in the US, they actually worked about 400 fewer hours per year than free white farmers did. We know this from how much a white person worked per year, and we know how much free white farmers produced in that time. Blacks are assumed to be equally productive per hour, and they produce less per white person per year. There was also a natural experiment that replicates this, done by Trevon Logan and his family, where they manually sewed and picked cotton without any mechanization. And the amount of cotton they produced on their little family farm was very close to that of historical yields during slavery. And today, even though blacks are actually slightly shorter than whites today, this is something a lot of people don't know, during slavery, blacks were actually slightly taller, which is evidence that they had better nutrition back then, or that they weren't required to work at as young an age as white children, or some combination of factors that made them taller than whites, even though, based on modern height, they're not genetically predisposed to being any taller than white people. Okay, let's go through the next thing. On the rape of black slaves, that's another slavery trope. Thaddeus Russell from A Renegade History of the United States says, quote, "Statistics further suggest that rapes were rare on plantations. Most of the mixed race in the South were either slaves who lived in cities where opportunities for interracial liaisons were far greater, or free. According to the 1860 census, 20% of urban slaves and 39% of free blacks in southern cities were mulattoes. But among rural slaves, which made up 95% of the slave population, only 9.9% were mulatto. Of the slave population as a whole, mulattoes made up only 7.7% in 1850 and 10.4% in 1860. Moreover, only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped raped by a master, only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. According to Fogel and Angerman from Time on the Cross, all of the available evidence taken together indicates that, quote, the share of Negro children fathered by whites on the slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Angerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There's also evidence of a significant number of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of children produced by rape even smaller. Also, a pinch test here. White men raping black women. This is something that literally almost never happens today. So it's a bit of a claim to say that it happened all the time in the past. White men are overwhelmingly not attracted to black women today, and there's no reason to assume that they would have been back then. And Thaddeus Russell didn't say this, but I will. 1 to 2% of black women saying they were raped by white men, all that means is 1 to 2% say that they were raped by white men. And if they were politically savvy, they would have a political reason to say that, even if it were not true. For the corporal punishment stuff, look, there's no data on that. We know of one guy who kept records on corporal punishment, Bennett H. Barrow, but you can't infer anything from that because unlike ContraPoints, I'm not a retard who bases his worldview on anecdotes. Intuitively, it seems unlikely that slave masters would try to create open wounds in their very expensive property in an era before antibiotics, where a cut could kill you. On top of that, black people in the US had a higher literacy rate immediately following slavery than did Russia. In 1870, Russia had a literacy rate of 15% compared to 20% for black Americans, and the continent of Africa didn't achieve a literacy rate of 20% until the 1950s. And lastly, ContraPoints needs some perspective. There were more black slaves sent to the Middle East than to the Americas, but the Arabs generally don't have this problem. The Arabs generally did not let their black slaves reproduce. They castrated the males, and today they don't have a problem with blacks. White people didn't have to free the slaves. They didn't have to keep them in the Americas, but they did. And because of this, ContraPoints is demanding the fucking sun and the moon from white people for this. Hypothetical, this is not a trick question. If black people didn't exist, if all those blacks were just sent back to Africa, would ContraPoints be demanding a whole bunch of stuff from white people to blacks? No, he would not, right? And that is the moral hazard of what he's doing. That is why what he's doing is kind of gross. White people could have packed them all on boats, sent them back to Africa, and be done with this whole mess. What's unique about white people is not that they had slavery, but that they ended it. Not only in their own countries, but in every country they conquered. The idea white people should be ashamed. The rest of the world should be ashamed that it took being ruled by white people for them to end slavery. To hang slavery around the neck of the race that is solely responsible for ending it. Not only without the help of anyone else, but with the resistance of everyone else. That it had to be imposed upon them to end slavery, to hang it on the head of whites. You have to be a real evil son of a bitch to do that. So if you wish to have blood on your hands, ContraPoints, be my guest. Though my guess is that blood is from constantly reopening that open wound between your legs where your genitals used to be while pretending it's a vagina.
There's an endless mill of content about how authoritarian and evil Black Lives Matter is, and how it's identity politics equivalent to white nationalism.
Well, I guess this is another thing that we can agree on, because let's take a country. And within this country, you got two groups. One is trying to break off from the other and partition and form a new country. The other has all sorts of legal advantages and really doesn't want this. They get preferential treatment in universities. The government requires that you get a certain percentage of government jobs from these people. They have set-asides. And they can freely form their own exclusive communities and exclusive organizations. While the group that wants to break off is legally prohibited from creating their own spaces. The group that wants to stay currently gets $300 billion in net wealth transfers from the other group, the group that wants to leave, and is constantly militantly trying to use their influence on government to get even more, to regularly bully any white who speaks out about this, as if he's some sort of heretic, that's medieval Europe, as an enemy of the revolution, Soviet Union, a suppressive, I don't know, that's Scientology. A communist anti-American, no, that's 1950s America. Racist, right. as a racist. So yes, it is crazy to compare the two, because white nationalism is inherently separatist and positive. It's about freeing one's own people from others, while black nationalism is inherently supremacist and negative. It's about extracting resources and rent-seeking from other races that their twisted ideology tells them is oppressing them, when in reality, white people gave them almost everything they have. People who are actually oppressed tend to have escape on their mind. They're not thinking about new ways of gaming the system to get more goodies that other people have to pay for. Like all these black marches. They get 260 points on the SAT for being black, but that's not enough. They want more. Because despite the privileges they get for university admissions, there's still a very small proportion of people at these universities. The truly oppressed don't think or act like this. The truly oppressed just want to get the hell out of whatever situation they're in. And that's what white nationalists are, and that's what white nationalists want. The truly oppressed want separation. You want to know who's oppressed? Who wants separation? You want to know who's dominating and oppressing? Look who's trying to game the system. Look who's trying to get even more goodies than they already have. This is also why ContraPoint's saying that you're left-wing. This is just loony. ContraPoint's, you're fucking Saruman. You're as left-wing as Saruman. Is Saruman left-wing? Who knows? Right? Saruman was an orc supremacist and he hates men. You are a black supremacist, raging against your own kith and kin. It's great. I mean, I'm looking at you and like, you really are like something out of a Warhammer fantasy codex. Touched by Slanesh, your body mutilated by the gods of chaos, turning against civilization and the people responsible for the world as you know it. And, you know, go ahead and laugh at this kind of stuff, but that's an archetype. And look at you. You are that archetype. ContraPoints likes to blabber about other people interviewing Nazis, oh my god, a Nazi.
Or, you know, we could just keep doing live streams with Richard Spencer. Interviews with Nazis, the new YouTube craze. God damn it. Now, a lot of people are gonna look at the incarceration data and say, if the blacks don't like going to jail, they should just do less crimes. Let's do another interview with Richard Spencer. You know what? Why don't we all interview Richard Spencer? Every single YouTuber. Free speech mandates that we all constantly broadcast fascist propaganda. Let's get them all in here. Every single Nazi in one giant live stream, and then we can finally give the Jewish question the platform it deserves. God damn it, where's my toad venom?
And this is you just not understanding the point of the internet. When you have a media environment where you can actually hear arguments out without it being chopped up and edited by addle-brained journalism majors, there's going to be a large market to hear new ideas that deal with reality. Now, there is certainly a market, as you are aware of, ContraPoints, to feed back shitlib narrative, and you make a certain amount of money doing so. You feed back the bad schools myth, the myth that redlining mattered, the myth of prejudice, the myth of race differences in lead exposure. You feed back slavery, which is a whole set of myths, and of course your trashy video where you deny divergent evolution in humans. But for now, there's also a market for people who point out that, you know, white people are responsible for the world as you know it, ended slavery, and benefited everyone on the planet. And these positive facts about white people make you livid, and you start screeching, Nazi, Nazi, KKK, because you are a spiteful little fungus of a man.
Заболела Дуниноголовка, заболела Дуниноголовка, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот и гребень, вот и лед, вот и 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. А чего же она заболела, а чего же она заболела, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот и гребень, вот и лед, вот и 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Из-под моря земли захотела, из-под моря земли захотела, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот и гребень, вот и лед, вот и 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Я на коре море перееду, я на коре море перееду, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот и гребень, вот и лед, вот и 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Из-под моря землицы достану, из-под моря землицы достану, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. свидетельница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен. Ты сиди, поглядывай, на меня поглядывай. Мы полечим Дунину головку, мы полечим Дунину головку. Мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен. Ты сиди, поглядывай, на меня поглядывай.